This is not a test. Stay calm in an orderly fashion. Make your way to the lifeboats.
Mayday, the ship is sinking.
Welcome back, everybody. For those of you who are joining us on YouTube, good to see you again. For those of you who are downloading us on any of your podcast app or anything like that, welcome back. We are going to be finishing up our stages of change model. If you listened to last Monday's, we talked about
pre-contemplation, contemplation, and preparation.
That is right. And if you haven't listened to that yet, I definitely suggest that you go back to that and listen to that before you listen to this. You can find it, just scroll up. It'll be episode 1. You are currently listening to episode 4, which is part 2 of a 2-part series. So continuing right into it, we are going to start off by talking about the stage of change known as action. So just as Hunter said, we went from pre-contemplation. So recapping, remember pre-contemplation is generally when you don't want recovery at all, you're not sure what you want to do, you see a lot more benefit in using than you do in, let's say, finding recovery. So that's pre-contemplation. And contemplation?
Contemplation is when that switch at least flips and you realize that there is a problem with the behavior that's been taking place. So you realize that using is not working for you anymore.
Right. And what would you say is like the number one thing from pre-contemplation to contemplation? What do you probably need to do?
Got to hit something that hurts, got to have something taken away, got to hit a wall, something has to click that says, okay, my problems are at least somewhat reflective from my using.
100%. And really it does come down to the self-evident truth that is found in every major group or any major recovery study or anything like that, which is you have to understand that this is a problem. A willingness to admit that my using is out of control, or a willingness to admit that my using is either the stem of many of my problems, or at least the stem of all of them or most of them or something like that. That's when you are probably going to go from pre-contemplation to contemplation. So 100%. From contemplation, once again, like Hunter said, you're just kind of focused on what it's a problem. What am I going to do next? And then you have preparation. Preparation is like, okay, well, I've decided what I'm going to do next. I'm going to go to treatment. I'm going to go to intensive outpatient. I'm going to go to meetings. I'm going to find a sponsor. I'm going to do something. So you kind of forward progression. Remember, if I've said this a couple of times now, the natural state of things is for them to denigrate. The natural state of things is for things to rot away, for them to slowly but surely fall to ruins. That is, if there isn't progression, if you're not moving forward, or if you're not building on something, slowly but surely it will evaporate in front of your eyes. A perfect example of that, a house, right? If you live in a house, you live in an apartment, what do? You sweep it, you dust, you do the laundry, you make sure that, there's not water leaking from the ceiling, things like that. You don't do that. You leave a house for, let's say, 2 years by itself. What's going to happen?
It's going to start to fall apart.
Start to fall apart.
Yeah, I've heard it said recovery is like walking upstream, right? So you're in a river and you're walking upstream. If you're not pushing forward, then you're getting pushed backwards.
Boom. Just like that. So when we go from pre-contemplation, contemplation to preparation, it's all going to be moving forward. Now, a note that we really didn't talk about last week, but I wanted to hit before we jump into our next 3 stages of change is the leap from pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, and then to our 4th step, which is action, which is what we're going to start off on today, can happen in a moment's notice.
100%.
We have seen it time and time again. Once again, for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, we're both professional recovery coaches. I'm a nationally certified one. Hunter is in the process of becoming a nationally certified one. We're both certified through CCAR, Connecticut Community on Addiction Recovery, and we're both recovery coach trainers.
Right.
So we've seen it, and we've seen it a lot. And trust us when we say it can accelerate in a week's time. They can go from I don't see a problem to a profound moment. Maybe they'll lose a loved one. Maybe they lose their kids or their house or something like that, to all of a sudden, I need something. I need to go treatment. Now. And then there's times where maybe it doesn't happen that quick.
Yeah.
And we've seen that plenty of times too, where it's they kind of mosey around the idea of contemplation. And then one day the revelation of recovery, as we call it here on ARC, happens. And they're like, okay, I need to do something.
Right.
And then they slowly but surely kind of drag their feet. Okay, supermarket-esque. I want to just take what I like off the shelf. So I need to do something, maybe not treatment, maybe not OP. Maybe I'll sneak into a meeting every once in a while. But as long as there's progression, like you said, as long as they're slowly, even all but incrementally working their way upstream, it's a good thing.
Absolutely.
Right. So today we are going to start off by talking about action. Then we are going to go into maintenance. And then we're going to talk about a sixth stage. Now, the sixth stage, once again, the sixth stage is not necessarily one that is always included. I know for our stage of change model, we often don't require this stage to be a part of the actual change, but it is something that does need to be noted because it is historically been kind of lobbed in every once in a while, and that's relapse, and we will get into that when we get there. But first, let's go ahead and talk about action. So, Hunter, what do you think about the action stage?
So the action stage it's one that lasts longest, other than maintenance, obviously, but it usually lasts the longest out of the first stages.
Sure.
So this is where somebody starts into recovery in one form or another. So we're starting to see the attitude start to, what we would recognize as recovery, I guess I'll say. So the attitudes would start to change. There's a lot of action going into changing the behavior. You still may be happening on a very small level at this point, but it is decreasing greatly by this point. Usually this action stage is when someone's in a treatment facility or they're learning about their addiction, they're going to meetings, or they're using MAT or something like that. They've decided to do something in order to change the behavior, and they're taking the action steps forward to make that a possibility for them.
And boom, just hit it right on the nose. Now, the action stage is a strange stage because it is one that fluctuates based upon the individual, not like the others don't, but the action stage can really be an individual can really be in the action stage for quite a long time, and they can also be in the action stage for a normal amount of time, but it's never going to be less. What I mean by that is oftentimes we would consider the action stage an individual to be in there 6 months or more.
Right.
Now, an individual is never going to be less than 6 months. And the reason for that is just because this is the clinical model, the scientific model. We like to see 6 months of active participant in the individual's recovery before they can start to say, okay, I'm going to the next stage, which is maintenance. And we'll talk about that in a few moments.
So I'll say, in a good illustration of this, in my own recovery, I'm sure anybody in recovery can really, I would assume, relate to this. It's up to 6 months in recovery. I had no idea what I was doing.
100%.
Yeah, I'm like, what do I do with my hands? You know?
Yeah,
like,
150%, man. I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
And I will say, in my action stage, my recovery was unique to me, just as everybody is their own. But my action stage, oftentimes it didn't feel like there was a lot of progression happening, and oftentimes, I was looking kind of around me, thinking like, am I doing the right thing? I was really hesitant and really like, I'm not sure, and kind of feeling my way forward as if I was somebody in the dark, just kind of feeling the walls, like what's next. But what I will say is the action stage, I really started to get into that pink cloud, and that I think is oftentimes the action stage is where that pink cloud starts to hit. I would say at the latter portion, maybe in the last month or two when we're starting to get to maintenance.
Yeah, I would say either in the latter or right at the beginning.
In that 30-day mark, they hit that 30-day, boom, I feel like $1 million.
Right.
Absolutely. And I think with the pink cloud, the pink cloud in the action stage, super dangerous.
100%. I mean, and it's important to clarify what we mean by pink cloud, because we're not talking about, like, I'm confident in my recovery. I do think that I have a good recovery foundation, but I'm also realistic in the fact that I know that I can still be triggered. I know that I still can't do certain things. I know I can't go around certain people. When we see the pink cloud, what makes it so dangerous is the feeling that nothing will ever touch us again. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's
they think I got over it. I'm good and I don't need that. And it's like, the truth is you need to often, we use the analogy of the pool in the ocean. When you are in early recovery, you need to be in the pool. You need to be where the four walls are, where I'm not to cross that and go there. And so often where I see people go wrong with the pink cloud is they get out of the pool, they start hopping in the ocean, and they start having that old mentality of, I found recovery, as if it's like this very physical and tangible object that I can put in my pocket and walk around with me. I found it. So now I shall always have it, which is an error in and of itself. And then once again, they leave it alone. So it starts to become atrophied because they're like, I'll never go back. So I'm just going to do this. And it's okay if I miss a meeting here and miss a meeting there, which if you remember last week, we talked about, okay, canary in the coal mine time. That's a problem.
Yeah. Red flags.
Red flags are coming. That's last Wednesday. And what often starts to happen is they start to get into the justification of behavior of like, I can go around the old people. I can do the old things. No, I have recovery. I'll be good. I can say no to a blunt.
Oh, I'm going to come back and give them recovery.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. What we call the recovering messianic figure.
Yeah.
Like I have come back to save my people. It's just like, I'm going to tell you right now, those people aren't interested and they aren't your people.
Don't do that.
Yeah. Don't do that. But no, they get into a pink cloud modality and they start to believe that they can function without there being the high level of accountability that was there before. And it's just so dangerous. And the reason we're harping on this right now is we cannot emphasize this enough. This is where parents and loved ones and professionals, even in our field, go wrong a 100%. Lot of the time. They start to see that the individual is doing well. And guess what? They probably are. But then they start to say, well, here's some responsibility, which is okay. Responsibility is important. One of the two things we like to talk about is how do you make purpose in an individual? Because remember, we talked about last week, really the only two reasons an individual relapse is lack of purpose or emotional trauma or unpacked emotions that they haven't been able to unpack successfully. But how do you create purpose in somebody? You create accountability and self-discipline, period. That's 100%. All you need. Accountability plus self-discipline equals that level of responsibility they're looking for.
Right. And I could see why it's so hard. Like where you said parents, especially. I remember in my recovery, when I went into rehab, I came out a completely different person than when I went in those doors. You know, and that's going to be true for most people in recovery is that first 30 days of abstinence from a substance and being surrounded by recovery oriented things, they are going to be a lot different than when you drop them off there.
Absolutely. And they're going to look like $1 million and they're
right.
You get to see the color in their eyes all of a sudden. And you're going to think
they're not all pale, you know,
lights back in it. Hey, mom, you know, they're happy. Hey, mom. Hey, dad. They're really excited. And this is where we see parents fail over and over again. We do some consulting with Families Against Narcotics. We do consulting with the courts. We do consulting with the hospitals. We have recovery coaches in all those places. And if we as an agency don't have those recovery coaches, we certainly have trained people that are in all those places and more. And we so often hear from recovery coaches and from parents, why did this go wrong? They were doing so well. They had 60 days clean and sober, and then out of left field, they used. And we're here to say, guess what? Was not a left field. There was something there that you missed.
Yeah.
You missed it. And I'm not putting that responsibility on you because the onus of responsibility always relies on the recovery. If they decide to use, they picked up that needle. They picked up that joint. They drank that fifth, whatever it is. But you miss something. And oftentimes what you miss is the recovery saying things that, if you remember us talking last week, for those of you who listened, they have that crisis of identity, or they lack the ability to understand that what they believe versus what they're capable of doing, that cognitive dissonance we talked about, is current. So what I mean by that is they get to a place, they start thinking I can do things and I will be okay. But what they really don't know is cognitive dissonance has already slipped in. It's the flip of cognitive dissonance. Normal cognitive dissonance for us is I'm going to go work out. And, you know, I'm going to wake up at 5 and I'm going to eat a good meal. I'm going to eat those eggs. I'm going to, you know, go lift. I'm going to get my pump on. Cognitive dissonance, right? Versus for recovery, it's flipped. They believe I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to go to this place. I'm going to be responsible. I have found recovery. And they start believing that just because they have some time in recovery. And here's the thing. It goes for more than just people with 60 days. We could be talking about 5 years. Just because they have that amount of recovery, they believe that I will be okay. It's the Kevlar vest that is going to protect me from anything that comes at me. And reality is their mind is thinking that, but their habits and the things that, you know, are deeply ingrained because the last 6 years they've been doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. As soon as they're in that situation, that devil on the shoulder is going to pop up. It's going to start talking to them. Well, I mean, yeah, you got 60 days, but you can get 60 days again.
Well, and I'll say that the biggest one I see pop up, the biggest temptation is always that you've got a handle on yourself now.
Mhm.
You know, and that's when I've had it in my own mind pop up. I've seen it in a lot of recoveries.
Oh,
I can
yeah.
handle going and just going to the bar and just drinking socially. Maybe I'll just drink on the weekends.
Mhm.
Maybe I'll just smoke this one blunt,
Mhm.
whatever it might be. It's just that, like, thinking that all of a sudden, now that we have some cognitive awareness to ourselves, because when we're in the later stages of addiction, there's really not much cognitive awareness there. We don't
Yes.
know what's going on. We're lost, right?
No,
We're like
we
lost
are
little puppies.
Lost in the fog,
Yeah.
for sure.
So then we regain that, and then all of a sudden the normal response is, well, now that I have this back, I can use successfully, or I could use moderationally, because you still want to get high, you still want to have that feeling. That's still there in the early recovery, especially. That's still going to be there, but now it's like I can get high and not have problems.
Yes, and that is number one where it's always going to go wrong, is first the justification that I can do without there being consequence.
Mhm.
No, the consequences, especially for early recoveries, will be severe and immediate. Those family members that have started to trust you, that saw the light in your eyes, guess what they're going to do? They're going to want you to go right back into treatment. They're going to want you to do this, that, and something else. And it is by far something that we have seen, just more than anything else,
Mhm.
is in early recovery, people make the mistake of I can do without there being consequences, or people make the mistake of I can go to these places and be in a part of these things without being
You
tempted.
see it in long-term recovery as well.
All the
Yeah.
time, man.
Yep.
And I've seen, I'll give you an example. I'm not going to use their name, but individual who really, he used quite a bit, relapsed in rather stunning fashion. I mean,
Mhm.
everything in the kitchen sink, right? And then ends up getting to a place where I need recovery. So what's the first thing he does in recovery? He starts surrounding himself with people that have recovery, and people that have what he wants, and people that can speak into his life successfully and say, like, hey, you probably should, be very cautious about what you're doing here. But the very next thing he does about a few months, 2-3 months later, is start to isolate.
Mhm.
And start to isolate, justifying that I need to isolate to figure out myself.
Mhm.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
It's a massive problem. I don't care what justifications you have in your head. The moment you start isolating is the moment that and if you listen to last week, you start to cut the external voices.
Mhm.
You do not want to cut the external voices. What you need to do is you'll have your internal voice, that voice you hear in your head, and the external voice, the people that speak to you. And you cannot cut those people's voices out. Now, you have to learn over time how to cultivate those things.
Right.
Like I can say in my life, I know the people that I trust to speak into my life.
Mhm.
And then if somebody average comes up and wants to speak into my life, guess what? They don't get to.
Right.
Or they can say what they want, but I'm not going to listen to them. So yes, you have to cultivate them. You have to know who you're listening to. But in his case, he decided to cut all the external voices off completely. And it's like, what are we doing? You are careening towards a cliff if you think that will work. Because is isolation necessary in recovery? Yes, sometimes.
To a degree.
To an extent.
Yeah.
Maybe
You
a
need
week. Like, I'm not talking about like I'm going to go up north and
a week even
fish.
scares me. Yeah.
I know, but I'm going to go fish. You're a huntsman. I go up and fish. I do those things. Yes, you can reach me by text, but for the most part, I'm focusing in.
Mhm.
I read. I get in. I become one with nature, and that's
Right.
my integration time.
I've never been called a huntsman before, and I kind of like it.
Taylor Hunter is now Taylor Hunter, the Huntsman.
Yes.
Huntsman podcast. It's coming soon.
Trademarked.
Trademark coming
Patent
soon.
pending.
But no, I think in that individual's specific circumstance, first off, he did it early recovery, which
Mhm.
was just like, that scares the
Right,
bejesus
right.
out of me, because you are careening towards a cliff.
Mhm.
Like you don't even know what you don't know yet. And then you're going to cut off anybody who may be able to speak into your life. What are you doing?
Right.
And secondly, it's not a good practice to have unless you have pretty much a set date behind it.
Mhm.
Here's what I mean. If I'm going to go quiet for a little bit, hey, I'm just going to, I don't need anybody talking to me right now, whatever. 1 week.
Right.
Call me Friday. I'll
Yep.
be good. Don't
I just need some time.
infinitum. Yes.
Right.
Not indefinite of like,
Right.
well, I just really need to figure it out and I'm going to kind of do this. And, I'll reach out to you sometime or something like that. It's like, that's not a good idea at
Mhm.
all. So especially in early action stage, that's early action or early recovery stages, you want to be really, really careful. Now, as far as the action stage goes, individuals in this, like we said, is usually going to be about 6 months.
Right.
One of the things that we definitely want to communicate to people too, and this is really unique. I wouldn't say unique, but it's definitely something that our agency does that it doesn't other agencies may not do is we usually don't start counting the action stage until somebody gets out of treatment or until somebody gets out of incarceration. And there's a couple of reasons for that.
Yeah. So one of the big reasons is in treatment, you're in a safety bubble.
Yep.
So you're surrounded by recovery 24/7. You are in an institution where drugs are not easily accessible. Prison's actually a little bit different because drugs are accessible in prison. So that's a little bit of a weird one, but there's definitely a higher level of accountability than just the outside world. So walking out into the outside world, whether that be transitional living, where you start reintegrating into society, or maybe it's just leaving and going back out to your normal day-to-day life, you start to get back around temptation. You start to get back around people who aren't in recovery. You get around people who maybe even aren't living the right lifestyle at work or something like that. And that's where the challenge really starts to begin. That's why action stage usually would start after somebody gets out of something like a treatment facility or prison. So.
Absolutely. And once again, it's not, when we're talking about these stages, they're somewhat loose. You know, we are bringing attention to these stages based upon individuals' needs. And so that we, as the recovery coach or the case manager, or whatever you might end up being, the professional, you can get a general sense of what needs to be happening next. Do I need to sever the service connection or whatever it might be? Because usually if we're getting to the end of action and starting in maintenance, we more than likely have severed the service connection at this point.
More than likely.
And we've kind of set down their merry way. So let's get into, I guess, the next step. It's a perfect segue, which is maintenance.
Maintenance, yeah.
So maintenance is a kind of an interesting one. Maintenance is considered to be kind of the top of the stage hierarchy. It is, once you're in maintenance, you're going to continue on in maintenance in time and memoriam, barring you don't have relapse, which we'll talk about that in just a second. Because in maintenance, it mushrooms out into the stages of recovery, which is, we're going to talk about that in a 2-part series, the next 2 Mondays, actually. But when you're in maintenance, you essentially have established yourself. You have found where you need to be in recovery.
Right. So yeah, usually at this point, someone's found their niche, right? So they found, maybe they like smart recovery, maybe it's 12-step, maybe it's just work, whatever it is. They found it and they said, this is working for me. I really enjoy this form of recovery, and this is what I will do in order to sustain my recovery. And then they're running with it at that point. So they're starting to put in the rituals and the habits that are going to keep them sober. So I'm going to go to 3 NA meetings this week. I'm going to go to church. I'm going to go to Bible study. I'm going to go to the mosque, whatever it might be, that's going to sustain their recovery into a prolonged.
Absolutely. And with maintenance, like right now, you would consider myself and Hunter in maintenance. We're in different stages of maintenance. And once again, we'll talk about that. But with maintenance, you always want to be diligent. It's something where just because you're in the maintenance stage does not mean by any stretch of the imagination you can let off the gas.
Right.
And this is where we see recoveries flub up time and time again. Is they get to this place, they get comfortable in their recovery, they play the game of like, I've had X amount of time or whatever it is, it's okay if I do insert here, or it's okay if I go insert here, or talk to the people again here. And when they get into that modality, they have already started to cross the path. You know, there are some places in recovery where you just have to set up a very, very hard boundary and just kind of say, I'm never going to cross that, because the moment in the day that I cross that, I'm going to be in hot water, or I know that I'm going to be tempted, or I know that I'm T-minus 10 minutes away from going into relapse.
Right. And you will see things back off in this stage as well. I mean, it is important, I guess, note, if you were going to 7 meetings every single week to get to this stage, it's not necessarily going to continue in that. So things will change, things might back off, but ultimately it can't change that much. You know, you need to figure out the rhythm that works for you to be in this stage. And it doesn't necessarily mean a relapse, but you'll definitely see quality recovery cut down if you start inserting A behavior or B behavior into your recovery. So
yeah, and maintenance, the tricky part about maintenance is everybody's maintenance stage generally looks different. Now, when you're looking at the early stages, pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, you are going to see a heck of a lot of similarities. There's going to be a lot there that's pretty clear. Like, yeah, you generally know where the individual is. When you get into the maintenance stage, the longer an individual is in the maintenance stage, the less you are going to be able to recognize exactly where they are.
Right.
Now, some dangers that and pitfalls that immediately fall into the maintenance stage. First and foremost, sometimes, not always, but sometimes the longer somebody is in the maintenance stage, one of two things start to happen. And one's really good and the other is not good at all. The longer somebody's in there, they become more humble. They become a lot more humility. They start to see the world in a lot different way. They start to see, them as a part of a bigger puzzle,
Right.
A piece in just the massive puzzle that is life. Or they start to become very arrogant. And we have certainly seen our fair share of those.
A few times, it happens.
Yeah. And usually it's depicted as, not to cast stones in a glass house by any means, but this is often where you hear the terminology, and I don't like this at all because it is stigmatizing and it's not good, but you hear the terminology, the AA Nazi, the NA Nazi, the person that I've got X amount of years and I've been here for the longest, and this is the only way to do this. And if you don't do this, then you're bound for relapse, or you're already in the cup or whatever it is. Right, and that's a huge problem.
For sure.
And we've talked about this, fairly extensively in our personal lives and our professional lives, and now on this podcast, which is in situations where people find themselves that they find it necessary to belittle other people in their recovery. There's a problem there.
Yeah, I'd say usually that's seen with abstinent addicts or dry drunks. I don't want to throw the stigmatizing things out there, but people who they found abstinence, but they haven't really found a quality of life worth living is usually where I start to see those attitudes pop up.
Yeah. And I 100% agree. And, that's not to say that they don't pop up every once in a while, because everybody in the recovery community, they all have their strong opinions. And the reality is we have not figured out this thing yet. That's why there's an entire field of science that has been progressing for the last 50 years about this thing. Right. And guess what? Still have only touched the tip of the iceberg. We don't know sometimes why certain people do certain things. We don't know why people act the way we do. We don't know why certain genes in our body react in certain people as to, for addiction. We can identify the genes. We don't know why they exist, why they have an addictive gene, right? But what we do know is that the only way for more people to get into recovery is by the law of attraction, is making it so that people feel comfortable to sit in meetings, to sit at tables and talk about these things. I mean, I've talked to people before in recoveries before where they go to meetings that, they don't necessarily agree with everything that's said at the meeting. Right. And they certainly may not agree with, let's say, how people have chosen to find their recovery. Maybe there's some medically assisted treatment things going there, Suboxone, Subutex, heck, maybe even cannabis nowadays.
Right.
But they find value at some of the things that are being said at the meetings, and they find, their recovery glass, if you will, is being filled.
Right. The comfortability has to be there. Right. And then the other thing as well is seeing somebody in recovery, that attraction piece, seeing somebody in recovery and being like, man, I would like the way that guy lives his life. That's, I got to say, the most attractive thing about recovery to me in early recovery was seeing people who were sober that were having a blast, that were living life to the full. It's like, that was the attraction for me to get into recovery.
Especially to know that they came from a circumstance that maybe isn't exactly like yours, but has more similarities than most people do to yours, and they're living. And they're respected in the community, and they're not only the recovery community, they're respected in the normie community, if you will.
Yeah, the normies,
the muggles. Those are the muggle community, but they're respected in it so widely in the community that how could you turn it down?
Right.
And inside of maintenance, as we discuss over the next 2 weeks, there's always a level of precaution that does need to be taken.
Absolutely.
There's with everything, which is completely understandable. But some of those things are around of kind of giving yourself the excuse. We talked a little bit earlier about the pink cloud. The pink cloud in early maintenance is, it's almost mandatory.
Right.
Almost every recovery has it. I've never met a recovery that didn't have a year and wasn't on a pink cloud.
Right. You found your space. You found your spot. Right?
Sure. And the biggest problem that we see by a mile pop up in recovery or early maintenance is what we consider slow to fast. And it's what we give it. And fast to slow.
There you go.
Fast to slow is indicative of an archetype. It basically is an individual who They've started recovery, and what happens? Their life improves. They got the job. They got their kids back. They get their car. They get their license. They're going to get a degree. You know, they got the family respect. They got community respect. And things are happening so rapidly that it's like a year, year and a half from where they were. They're like, oh my gosh, my life is light years ahead of whatever I thought it could be.
Right.
And they're on that pink cloud. And what often pops the cloud, what often is, the screeching halt to recovery is all of a sudden when things become slow, when you have to start working extensively for some things. Because guess what? Early recovery, there are going to be some things that happen overnight.
Oh, yeah.
Self-respect can come back in a hurry. And I'm not going to say it happens overnight, but, it can happen about 3-month time.
Right, you get a job, you get a house,
You're feeling like you got your stuff together. You're really feeling it. But when you start to get 2 years of recovery, guess what? That job, the position in your job, they're not going to give you that unless you work for it. And it's going to take a couple months, maybe a couple of years. It's going to take work. It's going to take going to get a degree. It's going to take whatever it takes. And oftentimes we see recoveries. I mean, I know you and I have had this discussion several times where, man, I don't feel like I'm moving as fast as I should. And then what?
Right.
What do you get to?
It turns into a slow climb. Yeah, for sure. It's like everything, it's almost like you're climbing up a mountain, and let's say every like 20 feet, we're hitting something. There's a goal, there's a goal, there's a goal, there's a goal. And all of a sudden it's like every 100 feet, there's a goal. So then it's hard to climb. It's just like clean time, right? So once you get your 2-year key tag, you got to wait until you have 3 years to get another key tag in a program. Things like that. It's like the things are further apart. You don't get rewarded as often.
Exactly.
It's a struggle.
Exactly. Now, the last one that I definitely want to talk about is relapse. Now, relapse, once again, it's the 6th stage, and out of the Prochaska and DiClemente's model, it is not inside of this model, but it is something that is often it is kind of thrown around. We in our agency and in our practice don't always consider relapse, but it is something that needs to be targeted. Now, relapse is just exactly what it sounds. What happens if somebody's in a maintenance stage for an extended period of time and they fall off the wagon? They go back into drinking. They go back into drug use. They go back into old behaviors, old habits. First and foremost, the thing that you have to do as somebody that is a loved one or significant other or something like that, the thing you have to do is point out the behavior, point it clearly, and do not accept, do not accept, the woo-woo-woos, I got it under control. Do not accept that. I've seen too many parents, I have seen too many loved ones come to me and say, well, they're drinking again, but there's no but. Right. It is no, it's going to be different this time. No, it's not.
Right. It's just on the weekends. There's just socially.
Exactly.
Right.
You need to put a hard stake in that ground. It is not, you have to be unflappable and unmovable.
The boundaries go back to where they were before the person got in recovery.
And they come back in stunning fashion.
Right.
You cannot, you will do yourself a disservice. You will do the recovery a disservice, and you will possibly kill them if you do not put those boundaries back up and make them just as hard as they were before. Because here's the thing, there is going to be trust issues for a very long time. If in recovery, people look to make amends. They hope that people that they've wronged before start to trust them again. And it is okay to start letting those guards down and start trusting them and all that kind of good stuff. It is not okay if a relapse happens that you just kind of write it off and say, oh, they'll get it back under control. They did it before. You are dealing with a different animal. You got to consider it as 2 different modalities, 2 different people, the person that was in addiction and then the person that is now in recovery. And it's Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, right? And I'm going to tell you right now, the person that is in recovery is Dr. Jekyll, right? Mr. Hyde is the person that is in addiction. And if they're in addiction before, then they're in recovery. The moment that they start using again and starting to fall off the tracks, they're going to become Mr. Hyde in a hurry, unless you cut it off very quickly and put your stake in the ground and say, no, this is what's good. You're going to go to treatment. You're going to go back to your meetings. You're going to go, you need to start doing this, what you were doing before, or else all these things will fall down.
Right. It's always important to realize when a relapse does happen, there's no slow progression back to old behaviors. There's no slow progression back to your life turning back into a running chaos. It is as soon as you pick up that substance, as soon as that substance is being re-entered into your body, it's off the wagon.
Yep.
There's no slow decline. It's you've picked up right where you left off at, or you picked up as if you've never stopped.
And I cannot emphasize this enough. And I can't tell you how many times we've looked at each other, just kind of the side glance and like, oh, what is happening?
Mm-hmm.
You knew it was coming.
Mm-hmm.
You knew it was coming, period. You knew it was coming. No negotiation. You're not going to find wiggle room on me on this. You knew it was coming. You saw it in your own behavior. You saw it in what you were doing. You started telling white lies. You started showing up to things late. You stopped doing your readings. You stopped going to meetings. You started feeling more depressed. You started feeling having more anxiety. You stopped talking to people about what was going on with you. You stopped going to your therapist. You stopped. You
Relapse,
knew it was coming.
Relapse happens in the mind and behaviors before it ever happens in real life.
It
Before that
manifests itself before you ever put that bottle or that needle in your arm.
Absolutely. And it's very easy to identify from like a professional standpoint after you have a little while in the field, but you see it. You see that guy who's always been to your appointments on time and has always been reaching the goals and has been going to 12-step meetings regularly or whatever it might be. All of a sudden, that's not the case. And then it's like the first week they're doing okay. And it's still like, okay, let's not have this happen again.
It's okay. I mean, if they show up to a meeting late because the bus picked them up, okay.
Right. Like it happens. Right.
But if it's like the bus ran late a second week and the third week, it's like, okay, after the first time I ran late, how are we going to avoid that again?
Mm-hmm.
After the second time, why didn't we implement this? Why didn't we implement the plan that we put in?
Right.
And after the third time, you're lying to me.
Right. And then you'll see a slow decline. And I've seen it in my own recovery start to happen. We've had conversations about this where I've almost fallen back into a, not a relapse, but like a not well in my recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a slow decline, but it was a very identifiable and
natural state is atrophy.
Yeah, scared me, man. And it's like
As
because I knew what it meant.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's power in the fact that you recognize that in yourself.
Yeah,
certainly.
Well, recognizing myself and I had enough support. That was the biggest thing. Having enough support put in place that could look at my recovery and be like, what are you doing?
Hold the mirror up.
Right. Like, that's not okay. Like, I don't know what you think you're doing, but that's not okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's when we talk about relapse, we can talk around the bend about this specific stage, but the problem is always going to arise that guess what? It's the onus of responsibility relies on the individual. I've said it a dozen times now if I've said it once. If the individual is heart set on relapse, but they will be pushed to relapse if people give them the justification.
100%.
And I see too many parents do that. They put up, for lack of a better term, they put up with the BS.
Mm-hmm.
They, oh, well, he moved back into the basement and he's smoking weed again. Problem.
Right.
Problem. Big problem.
Right.
Because last time when he moved back into the basement and smoked weed, what did he do?
Right.
Started putting a needle in his arm. Shocker.
And then he stole your TV.
But he might have. But he started stealing out of your wallet again. Yada, yada, yada. And it goes on and on and on when we start to see these behaviors start to take place. And here's the thing. We're talking about this for someone who's in maintenance. We're not necessarily talking about this for someone who's in action. Somebody who's in action, there should be a constant state of vigilance. If somebody's starting to slip in action, you're in a world of hurt. And
foot comes off the gas in action. Something
really bad is going on. And it's something like there's not a doubt. Okay, here's what we'll say. In maintenance, if somebody lets their foot off the gas and starts putting on the brakes a little bit, that's where everybody should be like meerkats, right? They all stand up and they're all looking in the same place, right? And looking around. That's when everybody should start doing that around the individual. In action, if somebody does that, that means the brakes have been slammed on. That means they're using again. It doesn't mean like, they're probably just no. They're using again. Like if they're
very close.
They're either using or they're a day and a half away from using. Because they do not have enough time to recognize what is happening here. Because in action, you are forming the diamond that is the coal. Right. So if you were in coal before an addiction, you are forming a diamond with heat and pressure over time. And it is a matter of after 6 months in action, they have that piece of coal that is slowly turned into a diamond. And this diamond is early recovery. And it's all you're doing is polishing the later you have recovery.
Tuning into the Lifeboat Addiction Geology Cast.
Yeah. But you're pressing it. You're making something. If they do that in action, if they do it in action, diamond hasn't even been formed yet.
Right.
Like it's just a piece of coal still. So that's a problem. But in relapse, we're talking predominantly about maintenance. I just wanted to get that in there.
Absolutely. And then I think I don't really know how to phrase this exactly. When we start to see a relapse happen inside of the maintenance stage, it is a very long process. Usually with maintenance, it's not like it's not like it would be an action. So if somebody stops doing the things, it's usually a month or two process leading back into relapse.
Sure.
And there is not really ever a point inside of that. It can even be a 6-month process. There's not going to be a point inside of that where it cannot be pulled back on track. It just has to come from a realization. That's why when we talk about support inside of recovery, we talked about that on, I believe it was Wednesday.
Yep.
We talked about the importance of connectedness in recovery. And that's why that's so important there, because if that connection is not there, me, myself, I might not see these red flags start to pop up. We also talked about identifying relapse warnings.
Last Wednesday would be episode 2.
Right.
Yep.
So those are why those things are so important, because those things, if we can identify that, great. But if we can't, we have people in our life that can identify them for us.
The external voices are so important,
Absolutely.
man, because you're absolutely right. There has not been an instance where it's a meteoric, the stars fall from heaven and hit you in the face and you were doing fine and dandy and everything's going great. And then all of a sudden you blink and you're at the liquor store getting your bottle. Like that, it doesn't happen.
Right.
There was a decline. There was a slow working towards it.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the thing. All of your behaviors may have been the same,
Right.
but in your mind, something was going on.
Yeah.
You weren't speaking it out. There was something happening.
Absolutely. I've never met an addict to relapse, or I'm sorry, a person in recovery. I say addict because I'm part of the Narcotics Anonymous community. So that is something, a lingo I might use from time to time. So just for a caveat there. So when we see somebody in recovery, get back into recovery after relapse, I've never seen anybody say, I do not know why I relapsed.
Yep.
I've never heard anyone be like, it baffles me because I was doing so great. And then one day I just used.
Well, I've had one, and then I looked him dead in the eye and be like, so we gonna try again?
Right.
Or
what's the real story?
Yeah.
Here? Yeah. It's always, I let up on self-care. I stopped going to meetings. I stopped calling my sponsor, whatever it might be, whatever your program was, that stopped.
Yes.
That has always been the case. So it's very clear and very easy for me to say that that is what leads to recovery in the maintenance stage.
And here's where things get super tricky, because oftentimes when we say things like this to parents, to loved ones, to recoveries, to POs, whoever it might be that we're teaching or having a conversation with about what's going on, they mistake us for saying this and saying like, oh, well, they stopped going to their meetings on purpose.
Right.
They stopped reading their literature on purpose. They
Right.
stopped doing this. It's like, that couldn't be further from the truth most times. Most times it takes the form of they ended up becoming so busy in their schedule that they forgot, or they ended up so busy in their schedule that they start negotiating with their schedule and say, what can I cut out?
Right.
Because instead of 8 hours at work, they're giving me possible 4 extra hours, and that's overtime, which is time and a half. And I get paid at that. And they know, which means I can do this and this and this, and I'm making money. And then it becomes, well, what can I cut out of that 12 hours? Well, I don't need to go to my meeting on Wednesday. And I don't need to go to my meeting on Friday. I can work those out. It's like, that's how it happens.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen once again, like, oh, never mind with those. I could be watching TV doing those things.
Right.
Very rarely. When it's in maintenance, oftentimes it's because I become too busy in my own schedule that I pour out so much into the world around me that I don't pour into myself.
Right. I've never heard anyone look at me and say, yeah, Hunter, I'm not going to continue to do that because I want to lead myself into relapse.
Yeah.
There's nobody I've ever heard say that. It's not a purposeful event for sure. And I think another caveat that's really important to point out in this relapse when we're talking about this maintenance, we kind of touched on it, but for a really clear cut on it, there's never a reappearance of old behaviors that were prominent during our addiction that should ever come back up in maintenance and not be very suspect.
Facts.
So we talked a little bit about that with we start seeing white lies or moving back into the parents' basement or anything.
Big problem. Any
behavior that you've seen, this is mostly for loved ones, maybe for professionals, any behavior you've seen in somebody when they were in active addiction that went away when they went into that action phase and worked through that stuff, if that comes back up in maintenance, major problem. There's never just a good reason any of those actions should ever reappear.
Because there's only one or two reasons it's there. Either A, they're about to fall back into relapse, or B, they didn't do it. They didn't do the steps the right way around the first time.
Or C, they've already relapsed.
Well, or C, they've already relapsed. But oftentimes when they start to do those things, because we talk about recovery as an all-encompassing principle. So when we say recovery, we mean everything from emotionally, spiritually, physically, stop using, financially, everything. We're talking about a complete, control reboot of what we are doing here, right? And oftentimes what can happen, and we see it too many times in early recovery, and it happens in early recovery and then manifests later on in the maintenance stages, is they do not get stopped at the door. People do not call them out on their behavior. So what ends up happening is they find recovery, they find abstinence, whatever it might be. They got the job, they got their house, they got their kids, they're doing the right thing, but they're still telling white lies here and there. And because they weren't called on those things are left to grow and grow and grow until 2, 3, 4 years on. All of a sudden, they're starting to tell lies more, starting to do these things more.
Right.
And it's because they did not do the right steps at the beginning, and nobody's called them really on it.
Right.
And that's why it's important to get a sponsor. That's why it's important to get a recovery community around you. That's why it's important to get a recovery coach. It's important to get an external voice of somebody that knows generally what's going on with you so that they can say, no,
right.
That's not how that works.
The problem with that as well is like, we can't surround ourselves with people who've never struggled with addiction.
100%.
It has to be some sort of support group that understands, because quite frankly, if someone's ever struggled with addiction, they might not see telling a little white lie as being that big of an issue.
Once again, you can do solo recovery. We believe that is definitely a pathway. It is possible. We've seen it seldom. But we have seen it.
Right.
But it's something where it's like oftentimes when we're talking about quality of recovery, when we're talking about recovery in general and talking about quality of recovery, we're talking about a multiple pathways model. And we're talking about people being relevant. I just want to clarify that. So,
and I will always push support to any recovery pathway that I believe in. There has to be some sort of support there of some degree.
Sure.
An individual, like we said, individual recovery is possible. It's just very, very seldom that happens. But if we're surrounding ourselves with people who also struggle with addiction in one form or another, or struggle with it in the past, they can see that behavior as being the problem that it really is. If I'm talking to just any, Tom, Dick, or Jane, they might not see a white lie as being an issue. They might not see that as being a problem because it's pretty prominent in our culture. I don't think that's really something that someone would be like, what? It's so not okay. But somebody in recovery would look at me and be like, that is not okay, because that is an addict mentality. That's something that people do in their addiction. So it's something that needs to be changed.
Now, and here's the justification that it irks me every time I hear it. Everybody lies.
Right.
Well, everybody tells lies. Everybody tells lies. And like, well, everybody but you.
Right.
Like, what are we doing here? Because you can, somebody who is in recovery cannot begin to find true freedom until they are not subject to the lies of their past and they're not subject to the lies of their future.
As long as I tell myself I don't have a problem, I'm never going to get better, right?
100%, man.
Honesty
100%.
has to take place at some point.
Honesty has to take place, and it has to be a level of radical honesty.
Absolutely.
It has to be an ability to say, I do not have control over this. I need help. And it has to be, especially later on, if it's something that has, for those of you listening who are in recovery that may still struggle with lying, you have to get really clear with yourself. A, why are you lying? Why?
Right.
Why? Are you afraid of getting in trouble? Why are you afraid of getting in trouble? Are you doing something that would justify you being in trouble? Why are you doing it?
Right.
It really is A to Z like that. It does come to, it's a difficult truth, big pill to swallow, hard to talk about, but why, and why?
And then the other reason I hear a lot is because you don't want people to judge you. You don't want them to look at you in a way of like, if you say that truth, that person's going to judge me as being a horrible person. Little secret for you guys about the recovery community. Nobody who struggled with addiction didn't ever do some really bad things.
Yep.
And nobody's going to sit there and be like, oh, but that, whoo,
yep.
Whoo,
How dare you?
Right.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's such a freeing thing when you're honest about everything in your recovery, because someone's going to look at you and be like, oh, I did that too. And then it's like, oh, what?
And here's the thing too, find somebody in your recovery, and preferably early on in your recovery, that ain't going to judge you regardless.
Right.
That person can take the spot of a sponsor, a mentor, can take a spot of a recovery friend, a recovery ally, somebody that is, you can tell them I did this, and they can speak into your life unbiasedly, not looking at you like, how the audacity, how dare you, but instead, shame, but instead can sit you down and have a conversation with you and say, why do you think that was a good idea? What do you think you should do? Sounds like the fact that you're bringing it up to me, you already answered your question. So what should you do next? Follow through.
Right.
Like, you find somebody like that, you're not going to go wrong.
Absolutely.
And the more people that you can cultivate for yourself like that, that's what we've been talking about the entire time. That's your external voice.
Right. Support. Yeah.
Those people that are going to be able to look at it from a different angle than you and say, hey, sounds like you already know what you want. Right. It sounds like you already know the answer to the question, but just for the sake of, strengthening the argument in your own mind, this is what you should probably do.
Right.
So, and Hunter will tell you, the way that we communicate, oftentimes it's just me asking questions.
I would say, yeah, if I come to Christian with an issue, it's usually I tell him the issue and then I tell him the solution to the issue. And he's like, okay, so why are we talking right now? Like, why, what, why, when, you know?
Yeah. And that's all it really does is I'm just using a living mirror and just saying, if he's already found the solution to that, barring that it's not something I'm like, that's a horrible idea. And there's been one or two of those where it's like, there's a train coming with your name on it, bud, and you probably want to get off the tracks. But barring it, it is a matter of like, okay, let's solidify the answer that you've already come up with in your head. Let's make an argument for why it's a good answer versus why it's a bad answer.
For sure.
So other than that, man, that wraps up today's podcast. Once again, if you're listening as a student, as a teacher, or something like that, we have them every Monday. We'll see you next Monday where we're talking about starting our two-part series on the stages of recovery. And if you're somebody in recovery and just like to listen to our silky smooth voices,
Oh yeah.
see you on Wednesday where we'll be talking about our meditations. Have a good one.